Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is my daily morning podcast, but actually, this morning podcast is going to be slightly different. I am going to be discussing this book. It's called Beyond Hypocrisy: Decoding the News in an Age of Propaganda, as well as two articles. I'm going to try to get through two articles and the book. One of them is Trump 2.0, 100 Days of Orwellian Newspeak. And the second is Trump is moving America into a land of doublespeak. We mustn't be fooled by it. So let's get started. This is chapter 3, and I'm going to put the reference for the book in the discussion section. So our natural right to subvert the search for defensible frontiers globally and in outer space. Imperial powers always have good reasons for expansion and for the repression of the victim nations they conquer and dominate. There is, first of all, the benevolence of the conquering power. Roman general Sertalus explained the conquered tribes in Gaul in the 1st century AD that in contrast with the Germans who entered Gaul out of lust, avarice, and in the longing for a new home, the Romans came to provide stability and by invitation only. There is, secondly, the need to defend oneself in the enlargement of the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most famous phrase of the lexicon of apologetics was the search for defensible frontiers. There were always neighboring states from which dissidents and guerrillas could find refuge and from which they could launch attacks. To preempt this required the conquest and subjugation of the neighboring states, thus establishing a more defensible frontier. This could, of course, rationalize continuous expansion of new neighbors and harbored guerrillas. So you can see Britain, conquered one and then found they were launching attacks on, British colonies from another. So then they conquered the next. And that was the British rationale for their, racist colonial butchery across the world. A third good reason that sometimes overlaps with the previous explanations is inadvertence. The imperial powers, in its blundering efforts to do good or to protect its borders, expands. This is the heart of Stanley Karnoff's explanation of the U.S. takeover of the Philippines and his account of the Vietnam War, both of which constitute the comprehensive abandonment of serious historiography. A final good reason for expansion is the natural superiority of the expanding country or race. Savages do not put resources to the best use. They do not make deserts bloom, nor do they make forests into deserts. They stand in the way of Übermenschen, which is, a racist idea. Modern imperial powers often conquer neighbors in the old imperial fashion, but they usually leave after a stint of pacification, leaving the neighbor in friendly hands. Modern empires also put relatively greater weight on destabilization and subversion of offending governments and the exercise of indirect control. The United States occasionally invades countries directly, usually to shore up its discredited puppet regime about to fall to indigenous but radical or reformist rules. For example, Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, and Lebanon. The invasion of Grenada in 1983 appears to have had a double motive: to stand tall in the wake of the loss of 241 Marines in Beirut, which occurred only days before the incursion, and to take advantage of the disarray following the murder of the head of state, Maurice Bishop, to oust a radical regime. Panama was invaded in 1989 in order to remove Manuel Noriega and reassert U.S. control, and to allow George Bush to stand tall. Indirect control of these two former clients was quickly arranged, aided by a modest pacification of the effort. But the United States has enlarged and protected its domains mainly through subversion, i.e. the undermining of disfavored governments by open and covert hostile actions that weaken their authority and strengthen the power of their enemies. This covers a wide range of activities, boycotts, and other forms of economic warfare, bribery, and stabilization of the politicians, journalists, and intellectuals, hostile propaganda, sabotage, and terror, direct and through proxies, and by the encouragement and support of coups. A very important form of subversion has been the wooing, bribing, and brainwashing of foreign police and military personnel who are brought to the U.S. facilities in Washington, D.C., Fort Benning, Georgia, etc., where they are treated lavishly, taught to distrust their own people, and made into de facto agents of U.S. power, frequently proving their words in the vanguard of subsequent coups. The United States has used these methods regularly against governments of which the elite and leadership disapprove. Table 1, produced the Real Terror Network, shows the enormous scope of U.S. subversive activity for 8 Latin American countries up to the early 1980s. This table is surely an understatement, as many of these subversive operations, like bribing journalists, politicians and military leaders, are hidden from public view and only disclosed on a sporadic and partial basis. And those countries are Brazil, Chile, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Uruguay. Those are the countries on the table. And again, I recommend purchasing this book. It's an excellent book on, doublespeak and Donald Trump and doublespeak, and how we can apply it to George Orwell's novel, which was, worried about an authoritarian, government, an authoritarian leader that, used doublespeak to basically to create a master race. And, that's something you have to be concerned about with, Donald Trump. Only by reading relatively obscure books would it be possible to find out that in the period leading up to the Brazilian coup of 1964, hundreds of Brazilian politicians had been secretly funded by the United States government, or that in the early 1960s, the vice president, minister of labor, son and physician of the president, and numerous police and intelligence officials and political leaders in Ecuador were on the CIA payroll among a vast array of equally subversive operatives. All these activities would be clearly identified as subversion and furiously denounced if engaged in by an alien power, but since they were done by us, different responses follow. First, the word subversion is inapplicable by semantic agreement that no such invidious word could apply to ourselves. Second, the media do a fine job of suppressing or muting evidence of our subversive actions, especially those that are less easily rationalized, such as organizing assassinations, bribing foreign politicians, and sponsoring coups against freely elected governments. But the media's greatest achievement lies in normalizing such activities and even giving them a high moral tone. In the trial of Manuel Noriega, the prosecution finally acknowledged that the U.S. government had paid him at least $300,000 for services rendered. But the prosecution claimed that this was not to support his drug dealing. It was merely a payoff for his service as a spy against his own government. The separation of hypocritical as if Noriega was paid for spying. His patrons knew about his drug dealing, and protection was part of the package. Most importantly, the media reported the admission of bribery as a high officer of a nearby client state was matter-of-factly, essentially reproducing the way information was conveyed by government authorities. There was no indignation at the use of protection of an important agent in the drug trade. By contrast, press reports of the arrest of Soviet spies in the United States, Canada, or elsewhere in the free world can barely conceal their indignation. The implication being employing spies is reprehensible. Our hiring spies, even when we have seduced high officials of friendly neighboring countries to betray their own governments, is passed through the prism of doublethink and treated as differently as our shooting down of civilian airlines. So our doublethink is treated as differently as our shooting down of airlines, right? We hire spies like Noriega for the US government, and it's fine, right? But the Soviets hire spies, and they're completely, we're indignated. Our media is indignated by the Soviet Union's audacity to hire a spy. The Soviet Union shoots down Korean airlines, and they're barbarians, they're savages, right? But when we shoot down the Iranian airlines in cold blood in a malicious, murder campaign, then, it was them, it was the Muslims of Iran. That's how our media reacts. That's how, racist Nazi, neo-Nazi type media. They are fabricators, double speakers, and double thinkers. That is all the American media amounts to. In a 1976 Senate report, disclosed that the United States had been involved in at least a dozen attempts to murder Fidel Castro. There's also substantial evidence that we engaged in a large amount of acts of sabotage against the Cuban property, that our Cuban refugee proxies committed numerous acts of terrorist violence against Cuba, including the blowing up of a civilian airliner, and that we even employed chemical and biological agents against Cuban crops and farm animals. If Castro had done similar things, they would be regularly cited as definitive proof of his terroristic and subversive proclivities. And if he or Gaddafi had printed a terrorist manual, such as the CIA wrote for the Contras in Nicaragua, the government and experts, quote unquote experts, and media would have a field day with such solid evidence confirming his or Gaddafi's terrorist qualifications. As it is, the Western experts never cite the Contra Manual and its applications as a case study in terrorist process, although it provides an outstanding model. The mainstream media mainly ignored these major acts of terror and treated them antiseptically as isolated incidents or blunders, not evidence of a criminal and terrorist activity. There was also a generous dollop of apologetics in uncritical reporting of official denials, alleged provocations, and references to security threats. Castro and Gaddafi revealed their true natures by questionable acts. The United States is provoked, or at most errs, and gives its enemies grist for propaganda. The search for honest quislings. Because the U.S. role in the third world has been primarily to shore up the old order, preserving the huge traditional inequalities of wealth and foreign privilege in the face of challenges from below, it has regularly aligned itself with local oligarchs and military leaders of an unsavory character who organize what the National Liberation Front of Vietnam called country-selling governance. In South Vietnam, in order to find leaders willing to front for a foreign invader and preside over the U.S. destruction of their landscape and people, the United States eventually had to reset to mercenaries who had fought for the French, were somewhat dim in intelligence, and were thieves and drug dealers. So you can see so far, we can see already, the double standard, the double think, the hypocrisy of the U.S. media and the U.S. government. They're complicit with each other. They lie, they peddle lies, then they follow the lies, and, they remove the history, they take the historical context out, and then they basically doublespeak. They just, pretend and say that this is the real news statement. This is dangerous propaganda. It's a fascist group of terrorists. It's like Ku Klux Klan terrorists of the American government, and they're, media lackeys is what I see this as. They make the lies, they peddle the lies against somebody else, and then they commit the crimes themselves, right? That's what it is. So, your friend who's a psychopath, you're a psychopath, and you just call your friend a psychopath, and you say, he's a psychopath, and then you say that he needs medication, he's a psychopath, we got to treat him because we're witch hunters, and you forget about your psychiatric illness, your major manic, tendencies, and your major mass murdering, sadistic, butchery. You forget that, and you call the other guy a psychopath, even though he's never committed any crime, right? That's the U.S. government, the U.S. media, the racist Christians of the United States, the racist Ku Klux Klan terrorists of America. The search for honest quislings. In country after the past half century, the United States has organized governments run by scoundrels who would do the necessary dirty work. The list is impressive. The old Chiang Kai-shek clique, Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese, leader, the Christian leader of the Chinese, Nationalist Party, who was, a scoundrel. He's describing him as a scoundrel. The U.S. puppet was a scoundrel. The mass murder of the Chinese Buddhist peasant was a scoundrel, according to Mr. Herman. The U.S. government should take notice of such statements. The rapacious and former collaborationist military leaders of Thailand, Argentina, and Chilean generals. The Shah of Iran, the Chilean general was none other than Augusto Pinochet, another scoundrel. The Shah of Iran, a scoundrel, a British and American scoundrel that slaughtered his own people. The Indonesian general, Suharto, who took over from Sukarno, another racist scoundrel of Indonesia, a scoundrel. Let's take the word racist out. Just call him a U.S. puppet scoundrel. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Stroessner in Paraguay, the Guatemalan generals, and Mobutu in Zaire, other scoundrels that were U.S., client regimes or U.S. regimes, U.S. puppet regimes. This has led to numerous establishment intellectuals and pundits to remark on the moral deficiencies of backward peoples and to trace the roots of the problem to Asian, African, and Latin American human nature. The idea is that there could be a pernicious selectivity at work, that the West sought out the drugs of preference, and that Western influence was itself corrupting, was, of course, an unacceptable line of thought. In regard to South Vietnam, Malcolm Brown regretfully observed in 1964, unfortunately, most of the really intelligent, dedicated, and patriotic men and women who formed the stuff of sound leadership stayed with the Viet Minh. Most of them, however, were eventually killed by U.S. military forces or by local mercenaries in Operation Phoenix or similar death squad operations. No generalizations based on such information about the aborting or crippling of the alternate paths of development can be found in the Western media. So what he's saying here is that the U.S. destroyed Vietnam. It slaughtered so many of the people in Vietnam, the civilians, and it gave them no path other than dictatorship, right? I mean, you create the situation, the environment for which they have to be dictators. And then you criticize them as Asian dictators, like crazy Asian dictators. The racist Christian, Ku Klux Klan terrorists of the American government are criticizing the Asians, the Southeast Asians in Vietnam for being crazies, right? I mean, it's the U.S. government that are crazies. The racist Ku Klux Klan terrorist government. That's what he's saying. That's what's in his words. Moderates and extremists. The leaders put in place to serve U.S. power are invariably labeled moderates by the U.S. mass media. This follows the definition from the fact that they are supported by the U.S. government and serve U.S. interests. U.S. officials treat them as reasonable people we can work with and suggest that any little unpleasantness in which they may have recently indulged in are under review and will be corrected soon under our tutelage. That is, they will do our bidding, kill only the right people, and allow foreign investments and sales, even if it is at a heavy price in a corruption drain. Indonesian head of state, General Subandro Suharto, for example, came into power on the wave of an outburst of terrorism that involved the slaughter of between 500,000 and 1 million people, mostly landless peasants. He and the coterie are also contenders for the honors and the greatest thieves of history. But Suharto terminated any popular radical threat to control of Indonesia and has maintained the open door to U.S. investment and served as a staunch U.S. ally. Despite the mass slaughter he has therefore been treated by the U.S. political and corporate leadership as a fine fellow, as has the media and intellectual community referred to him as a fine fellow. Thus, the Christian Science Monitor on February 6, 1987, referred to Suharto as a moderate leader, and Michelle Leifer, writing in the Liberal World Policy Journal, featured the stability of that Suharto brought to Indonesia, acknowledging extreme corruption and serious human rights violations only in passing. Generals Videla and Viola, Argentina generals, during the Holocaust of 1976 to 83, were regularly referred to by the New York Times as moderates and democratic leanings. In 1933, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Berlin communicated to Washington the hope that U.S. interests lay in the more moderate section of the Nazi Party, headed by Hitler himself, which appeals to all civilized and reasonable people and appeared to have the upper hand over violent extremists. So you can see the U.S. was friends with Hitler. Even, the regime that they, decided to take over, attack. They became friends. They were friends with this guy. So you have to know the U.S. government, its misjudgments, its doublespeaks, its double talk, its deception, its racism, associated with its media, its, terrible media, its, double-speaking media, its inaccurate portrayals, its one-sided biased reporting. All of that stuff you got to take account and you got to be aware of if you want to understand and decipher the news and understand what's really going on in conflicts that America is involved with. The tone employed in treating these client states as killers is always low-keyed, and their motives are seen as benevolent. The London Economist described the situation as Suharto as at heart benign. The New York Times wrote, "What is in doubt is not General Videla's good intention." But these publications never impute benign hearts nor good intentions to leaders of enemy states, such as Daniel Ortega or Fidel Castro. Such individuals are invariably treated with sarcasm and sneers, their motives suspect. The difference is based completely on political bias sustained by selective reporting. So you can see he's saying the American media's biased reporting, its political bias of the U.S. government and their politicians result in, selective, praise, heaping praise by the Washington. This is the Economist, the London paper, the Economist, just like the U.S. New York Times, the Economist, a London paper, supporting the mass murdering butcher, Suharto, in public, in print, right? We have these journals. The Economist is great for criticizing all kinds of different good people across the world. But, you take a big mass murder, like a slaughter of 500,000 people, over 1 million people murdered by Suharto. And, he's benign at heart. He's, a hearty guy. He cares about his people. That's the way they think. That's the way the U.S. racist Christians and the British racist government think. And they're, not the British racist government, let me correct that. The British media, the British press, the racist press of the British Commonwealth thinks when they describe these people. Following the propaganda lead of the government, the media commonly establish the moderation of client state leaders by claiming that the moderates in high office are regrettably unable to control the extremists and affiliated with them, who seem to be doing a good deal of killing. The violence is ascribed to tragic battle between extreme leftists and extreme rightists, with our friendly government officials in the middle. The extreme rightists may be government agents, either members of the armed forces or of death squads, often composed of past and present members of the armed forces. But in the government media version, the moderates in the government do not condone these murders and are striving to improve things. We must therefore support them in their struggle to control the subordinates and agents. The droll exercise in apologetics was evident in the Times editorials and news reports on Argentina. In the editorial cited above, General Videla and the officers who surrounded him held out for more moderate course. There is no evidence that he and other members of the ruling junta condone this recent military excesses. What is in doubt is not General Videla's good intentions, but his ability to control military men driven by obsessions. The apologetics of state terror, which is repeated in other editorials and manifest in the news coverage, was never supported by evidence. It resulted from taking at face value the self-serving statements of Argentine and American U.S. officials, just as Soviet journalists might have reported, without question a claim that by Stalin that the ongoing killings and torture grieved him and were carried out by his subordinates out of control and obsessed with a fascist and Western imperialist threat. So you can see the media takes at face value the U.S. government statement and the Argentine government statement, saying that General Videla, the military access, the death squads, the Nazi cutting down of Hispanic campesinos, it was just fine. It was just, there were excesses. We know we have to murder Hispanics, but, it's just excess, too many Hispanics. So we justify it. We say that, he at heart, he can't control it. That is, not backed by evidence, right? That's not backed by evidence. You just make a statement, double speak, double think, don't back up any evidence. And then you mislead everyone. You mislead everyone into thinking General Videla, who was a mass murdering butcher of the Argentine right-wing dictatorship, during the 70s and 80s, was, a good guy, like he was, good at heart. A 1980 Amnesty International report exposing the 60 Argentine detention centers in which torture was carried out and which linked the death squads to the military establishment was never found newsworthy for the New York Times. News selection and suppression complement the service of acceptance of propaganda for friendly terror. The government and media employed the same apologetic frame for state terror in El Salvador in the 1980s. Here, Jose Napoleon Duarte was a moderate head of a moderate junta, unable to contain the extremes of right and left. The death squads were rightists out of control, like the Argentine army. This was once again implausible and fraudulent, as most of the killing was done by the Salvadoran army, and the death squads were a controlled and protected affiliate of the army. Duarte was a powerful figure who gave the impression of moderateness by an earlier history that was irrelevant to his performance and role in the 1980s, but which was repeated without question by the mainstream media. Subsequently, Alfredo Cristiani played the same role as frontman for the extreme right-wing Arena Party, founded by Roberto de Aubuisson. As he served U.S. power, the nominal power and fig leaf role were once ignored. Cristiani was a moderate by the fact of his service and acceptability to U.S. officials. The wrong record of media apologists that has made any servant of U.S. power a moderate has left only one question remaining. Is there any limit to scoundrelism that would cause an individual supported by the U.S. government to fail to be identified as a moderate in the U.S. press? No limit is observable yet. When Roberto de Aubuisson came near to becoming president of El Salvador in 1982, U.S. officials began to stress the variety of the Arena Party, the doctrine of changing course, and the importance of giving people a chance. Ambassador Hinton said that anyone who believes that the democratic system should give him, de Aubuisson, the benefit of the doubt, the press began to accommodate as well. A 1982 interview with the Mexican paper El Dia, in which de Aubuisson lauded the Germans for their efficiency in handling the Jewish problem, was suppressed. And an article by Warren Hogue in the Times in April 1st, 1982, captures the new look of fascist in process of becoming a moderate. Rightist flag bearer is accompanied by flatteringly thoughtful picture of de Aubuisson, and the article criticizing him gently for his impulsiveness and desire for confrontation and the fact that behavior was uneven. Staged elections as a control device. The United States has mastered the art of staging elections in third world client states as a means of assuring the home populace that a U.S. interventional process is meritorious and serves a higher purpose. These demonstration elections are fraudulent in their very essence for the following reasons. They're organized by a foreign power as a public relations effort to ratify the rule of local authorities already satisfactory to the foreign power, where elections will not yield the desired results, perhaps because of local environments cannot be controlled. As in Vietnam in 1956, the United States avoids them. They're usually held in a stint of military occupation and pacification and under conditions of ongoing state terror, which weakens and decimates the oppositional forces, leaving the voting populations fearful and traumatized, and allows the loyalists to control the machinery of elections. Put otherwise, the main conditions of a free election: freedom of speech, assembly and press, freedom of intermediate organizations, of mobilized people, freedom of all factions to put up candidates, and the absence of fear and terror among the populace has never been even approximated in U.S. staged demonstration elections in Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, and El Salvador. Even beyond these considerations, the intervention of a powerful outsider by its very nature alters the parameters of an election. By the biasing effects of massive deployments of foreign money and propaganda, and by the need of indigenous parties and the populace to placate the intruder. Although these points are quite obvious, U.S. demonstration elections in South Vietnam in 66, 67, in the Dominicas in 1966, and in El Salvador in 1982, and later the Guatemalan elections of 1984 to 1985 were extraordinarily successful because the U.S. mass media handled them like a propaganda agency of the government. The government said, in effect, focus on long lines of voters and smiling faces, stress the size of turnout, and don't discuss freedom of the press, free speech, and decimation of dissident organizations, the inability of the rebels to participate, and state terror and fear. Just leave those things out and discuss all the positive things, the smiling faces in the elections, so that you get, a good, wholesome reporting of the election that the U.S. staged. They're criminal rogues, they're mentally deranged criminal rogue butchers. It was pointed out in the preface that in connection with the Nicaraguan election of 1984, the mass media, again following in the lead of government, simply reversed agendas, forgot about procedural fairness, and concerned themselves with freedom of the press, the ability of the opposition to run, and the like. As we noted, this pushes us to the limits of doublethink and doublespeak, using different criteria for demonstration elections, and that those opposed by their own governments, and even misrepresenting facts within the framework of double standards. The mass media duplicated that fear in their coverage of the Nicaraguan election of 1990. Their view, without exception, was that Mr. Chamorro and UNO beat Ortega and the Sandinista in a free and fair election, marred only by Sandinista abuses. It was repeatedly stated that this was the first free election in Nicaraguan history, the basis for the claim being that the Reagan administration had declared the 1984 election a sham, which was therefore an established truth for the free press. The fact that the Latin American Studies Association Observer Team describes the 1984 election as a model of fairness by Latin American standards, and that Lord Chitinus, representing the British parliamentary group, had found it superior to the Salvadoran election of the same year, had no impact on the mainstream American media. These authorities came to the wrong conclusions, and their message was therefore simply not reported. For David Binder, the Chamorro victory in the 1990 election was a payoff for U.S. patience in pursuing the electoral option. The decade-long U.S.-sponsored terror and economic warfare was written out of history and was not mentioned by him as a primary area in which the United States has displayed both diligence and patience. In the real world, the U.S. attacks, which devastated the Nicaraguan economy, were certainly the primary contributor to the fall in per capita income of over 50% between 1980 and 1990. It seems obvious, therefore, that the United States had purposely titled the playing field in a direction unfavorable to the ruling party. It is a cliche of U.S. politics and parties in power, in that parties in power are punished by the voters for poor economic performance. The U.S. media never assessed this deliberate creation of an unlevel playing field and is bearing on the outcome of fairness of the election. The massive intervention in the United States in funding opposition of groups and parties and engaging in numerous manipulative activities in Nicaragua was mentioned only briefly, at all, if at all, and it was never suggested that this was a gross infringement on Nicaraguan sovereignty or affected the election results. The fact that similar interventions by foreigners in a U.S. election would be illegal was never mentioned. The only suggestions of possible unfairness were found in the Sandinista control of the army and election machinery, for which the New York Times made the Sandinistas a Goliath in relation to U.S. supported coalition. Finally, the future of the United States to dismantle the Contra army in accord with the Tela Agreement left the terrorist force in place to resume operations, and Mrs. Chamorro lost. President Bush told Mrs. Chamorro publicly that the boycotts would end if UNO was victorious. There was thus every reason to believe that if Goliath triumphed, economic and proxy terrorist warfare would continue by the United States. Nicaraguan voters therefore cast ballots under conditions of blackmail. Vote for Chamorro and UNO or suffer further superpower attack. The point was never made in the mainstream media. The Nicaraguan people finally said uncle after decades of terrorists and boycott, and an over 50% reduction of income, and a blackmail threat at the moment of voting in 1990. That the U.S. media could trumpet this as a triumph of democracy is beyond hypocrisy. So you can see the Nicaraguan election, an example of, the U.S. extortion blackmail at the butt of a pistol. You take the campesinos, you torture them with, mass murder, just torture, mass murder, extrajudicial executions and forced disappearance, kidnappings, and slaughter. And then you say, go vote. But, leave the Contras there, let them sit around, show their face while the election is going on. And there you go. You got a free and fair election to the American government. That's free and fair. They are racist, Ku Klux Klan terrorist government of the United States. That is the sort of logic they have in this Nicaraguan thing. The Reagan administration is a Ku Klux Klan group of terrorists, thugs, hoodlums of, humanity. Terrorism and retaliation. One of the most potent weapons of the Western establishment designed to justify beating up smaller countries is the need for defense against terrorism. The terrorist is a fearsome symbol, conjuring up visions of a bewhiskered foreign feature bomb thrower threatening Western white innocence. Like national security terrorism is a funny notion that can be employed with greater indignation against selected enemies while ignoring, supporting, and carrying out similar actions by ourselves and allies. This can be accomplished only if a cooperative media will not look closely, ask questions, and challenge double standards and propagandist usage. And the U.S. mass media have been more than cooperative. The use of propaganda weapon has been greatly aided by the rise of an industry devoted to producing and disseminating the West's selective version of terrorism. The industry consists of government officials, terrorism experts, housed in and funded by government-related and corporate-funded think tanks and private security firms. The experts and security firm personnel work for governments and corporations who have their own narrow views of terrorists. Salvadoran peasants, Chilean workers, and South African blacks would have a different view, but they don't have the resources to fund think tank experts and databases listing terrorist incidents. The funded experts respond to their funders' demands, and not surprisingly, it turns out that the West is defending against terrorism, not terrorizing, that Libya and North Korea are terrorist states, not El Salvador, South Africa, or Israel. So you can see he's calling Israel, South Africa, and El Salvador as terrorist states. And he's calling North Korea and Libya as not terrorist states. So you can see the West, distorts reality through their, high-fi political money, their cash, their corporate media. All this stuff gets together and, lies and peddles lies and propaganda and turns Israel into, a human rights, haven, and turns, South Africa, the racist regime of South Africa that slaughtered its own people. It slaughtered its own people. And what did they say? What did the white people of America say? They were dirty niggers anyway. That's what the Americans said when South Africa slaughtered its own people as a terrorist nation state. So we know what America's about. It's just a little joke, but we know what America's about. The racist, Ku Klux Klan terrorists of the American government is an appropriate statement for the U.S. polity. On February 2nd, 1988, FBI Chief William Sessions told the press that the surveillance of CISPAS has been legitimate because it had possibly given support to a terrorist organization, namely the FLMN rebels of El Salvador. In any rebellion forces used by secession's logic, George Washington's army was a terrorist organization. If we consider, as we obviously should, who initiated the violence, whether the rebels had explored political options before resorting to arms, and the forms and levels of violence and intimidation, the evidence is clear that in El Salvador, state terror came first and on a large scale, and the political options were entirely foreclosed before the armed rebellion developed. As Archbishop Romero told President Carter in 1980, the people's organizations are fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights. And in his diary, he noted that the opposition forces were being subjected to a general program of annihilation to which they were responding. Given these considerations, the FLMLN should not be regarded as a terrorist organization at all. It is more reasonably described as engaged in self-defense and counterterrorism against the Salvadoran state and its external U.S. managers. Who are the real terrorists? So the U.S. government is the real terrorist, so is what Mr. Herman is saying. And I am in complete agreement. I am in complete agreement with this conclusion based on all the wars and the vicious campaigns that the U.S. has launched. Again, it's a fuzzy area. Terrorism is a fuzzy area. One terrorist will call another a terrorist, and the U.S. government will call, the Venezuela Maduro a terrorist, right? And then when they capture him and say, they call you a terrorist. Well, he was a dirty spick, right? That's what the U.S. government, the racist Ku Klux Klan government says. They love to put that, racist, epithet into their, jargon and statements. So, how does the propaganda system obscure the evidence that the Salvadoran state terrorists and that the United States, as the organized protector and supplier of the regime, is an international terrorist state? Partly by arbitrary and highly political word manipulation, and partly by brazen government media doctoring of evidence. An important element of the word manipulation is the confinement of terrorism to acts of violence and intimidation carried out by individuals and small groups. Dictionary definitions have always extended the reach of the word to governments, and in years gone by, terrorism was associated primarily with governments. This was based on the quality and quantity of violence carried out by state and non-state actors, as only states use systematic torture as a method of intimidation, and the scale of their acts of violence makes the terrorism of individuals and small groups look relatively insignificant. The concepts of retail and wholesale terrorism capture the fact that individuals and rebel groups is on a small retail scale, whereas state violence is on a large wholesale scale. The shift to using terrorism only for a small-scale violence was a highly political choice word use, corresponding to an identifiable political agenda. In 1981, President Reagan and Secretary of State Alexander Haig announced that they were shifting U.S. priorities from human rights to terrorism. Human rights policies were concerned with the abusive activities of states like Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, and South Africa. These countries were already receiving muted attention given their client status, but Reagan was actually entering into alliances with these agents of wholesale terrorism, all of whom greeted his accession to his presidency with enthusiasm. The point of the newly invigorated concern over retail terrorism is partly to divert attention from the now constructively engaged state terrorism, who were unleashed to invade and kill on a larger scale in Lebanon, South Africa, and Central America, and partly to justify other Reagan policies, rearmament, the upward distribution of income, etc., which required a patriotic, confused, and therefore more manageable public. The media went along with the new priorities and our related system of doublespeak and propaganda about terrorism and without notable dissent. And we're coming to Israel. We're going to be coming to Israel. There's a little section on Israel and Palestine. I think it's, good to discuss. I think, the Israeli government, it's a terrorist terrorist government. We know it. It's a terrorist state. It's a terrorist group of, racist thugs. They are racist thugs, and that's who they are. They're racist thugs and, mass murderers of Israel. So let's keep going. Confining terrorism to acts of retail terrorism is sometimes nationalized on the ground that they attack innocent civilians, whereas state terrorists are presumably more discriminating. While this stance is made plausible by airline hijackings and airport bombings, it is a false generalization. Retail terrorists are often highly selective, and state terrorists frequently engage in deliberate intimidation by murder of large civilian populations. The National Liberation Front in South Vietnam, for example, punished caterers who victimized untargeted civilians. On the other hand, B-52 bombing raids in Vietnam and by the United States and Israeli bombing attacks on heavily populated areas were and are well understood as efforts to victimize non-combatants. Like we bombed North Vietnam, right? We've bombed B-52. We did B-52 bombing of civilians, and we, committed terrorism against them. And when we called out about terrorism, they say, well, they were, mere gooks. It doesn't matter. They were just mere gooks. We're not worried about their life. They're low life. They're gooks. That's what the U.S. government said. That's what Donald Trump and his friends would say about the Hispanics in South America, where they, took Maduro out. They would say he's just a spick anyway, right, Donald Trump? That's what you would say, and that's what your U.S. government is about. Racist epithets and, colored slaughter of civilians in colored nations. Another important doublespeak device for rationalizing one's own and friendly terrorism is to describe retaliation and counter-terror. Okay, on the other hand, B-52 bombing raids in Vietnam and Israeli bombing attacks on heavily populated areas were and are well understood as efforts to victimize non-combatants. After Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin had criticized earlier labor governments for indiscriminate attacks on Arab civilians in response to attacks on his own policies, Labor Party spokesperson Abba Eban defended the earlier bombings on the grounds that there was a rational prospect ultimately fulfilled that afflicted populations, i.e. innocent civilians deliberately bombed, would exert pressure for the cessation of hostilities. In other words, the intent of Israeli bombing had been to intimidate the civilian population into pressing their leaders to alter their policy. This is a confession of planned, indiscriminate murder of civilians. So you can see the Israeli government planned indiscriminate murder of civilians by bombing, targets, as a result of its need to change the policies of the competing regime, right? What we do is, when we have too many Muslims around us, we bomb the civilians to tell the Palestinian Authority or whatever authority, the Lebanese Authority, Iranian Authority, that what you got to do is you got to change your policies, right? You got to shift your policies, slaughter civilians to change policy. That's called planned, deliberate, indiscriminate murder of civilians, just, for the sake of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, just so that you know the truth of what you actually did. Another important doublespeak device for rationalizing one's own and friendly terrorism is to describe it as a resolution and counterterror. The trick here is arbitrary word assignment. That is, any violence engaged by ourselves or our friends is ipso facto retaliation and counterterrorism. Whatever the enemy does is terrorism, irrespective of facts. Of course, the enemy always says that his violence was provoked by prior acts of ours and our clients that he designates as terrorists, but the enemy claims are never allowed. Our claims and those of our allies are never questioned. When the Israelis bombed Tunis in October 1st, 1985, killing some 55 Palestinians and 20 Tunisian bystanders, the Reagan administration and Western press found that this was retaliation for prior PLO actions, but the PLO's explanation that its acts were based on earlier Israeli acts were inadmissible. World assignment based purely on political preference is doublespeak in action. The Reagan administration, by not allowing the PLO to speak back, is working on doublespeak. The Ku Klux Klan, terrorist American government, backing the Israeli terrorists up in their campaign of terror in Tunisia. The Orwellian quality of this selective assignment of the words terrorism and retaliation is highlighted by the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon in the sequence of violence and by the factual background of this invasion. The official U.S., Israeli, and Western media formulation is that the invasion was designed to eliminate pockets of terrorism. But the invasion took place after a period in which the PLO had successfully maintained a ceasefire on the borders of Israel for 11 months, despite Israeli provocation. This caused consternation among the Israeli leadership because it made it hard for them to use the claim of terrorism to refuse to negotiate a political settlement. On June 25, 1982, the Israeli analyst of the PLO, Yehusha Porat, wrote in Haaretz that the decision of the government, or more precisely its leaders, to invade Lebanon flowed from the very fact that ceasefire had been observed. He went on to say the government's hope is that following the invasion, the stricken PLO, lacking a logistical and territorial base, will return to its earlier terrorism. It will carry out bombings throughout the world, hijack airplanes, and murder many Israelis. In this way, the PLO will lose part of the political legitimacy that it gained, undercutting the danger that elements will develop among the Palestinians that might become a legitimate negotiating partner for future political accommodations. In short, the Israeli leadership wanted and deliberately provoked the PLO terrorism to justify a refusal to negotiate. This makes the Israeli invasion a major act of terrorism. The latter PLO acts responsive and induced by the plan. But in Western ideology and the Western media, the peddling doublespeakers of the United States and Western media, this does not alter the rule. Israel only retaliates. The PLO engages in terrorism. We can see that the use of doublespeak by arbitrary word assignment is bolstered and even requires a refusal to look at current and historical fact. Fact suppression is extremely important to doublespeak in general. As we can see, we said that yesterday. We gave many past ideas. The wars in South America, the wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the war in China, the containment of China, and the attacks on China. It's an example of the U.S. Western doublespeak. It's just nonsensical doublespeak by the U.S. government, hiding facts, hiding reality, and taking an agenda and taking a position, to justify your, actions that are based on, Ku Klux Klan racism. I mean, American Ku Klux Klan racism. Israeli and the Palestinians. The Middle East, and especially the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, has yielded a cornucopia of doublespeak usage. This is a result of the huge gap between the Western pretensions and nominal values and on the one hand, and on the Western interests and policies on the other. Israeli governments have absolutely refused to do any political business with the Palestinians for decades and have carried out policies toward Palestine and Israel that have been regularly compared in the Israeli and world, but not U.S. press, with those of South Africa. So remember, the South Africans, they were, slaughterers. They were, slaughterers of blacks. And, I know the U.S. government and Britain are, very careful about Africa. They want to not offend Africa, racist epithets and all that stuff. But we know what they did. You can't, cover up your slaughter campaigns and your colonial abuses with, a few, polished politics. I mean, we know what it is. We know what the, Keir Starmer and Donald Trump think about, the Somalian Muslims that come to Britain and the United States. Send the dirty niggers back, right, Donald Trump? Right, Keir Starmer? That's the way to go, Donald Trump. Send the dirty niggers back to Somalia. That's your words. That's the American government. Ku Klux Klan terrorist government of the United States of America. Doublespeak on the Middle East is only greatly affected by the power of the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States. In addition to its virtually unconditional support for Israeli actions, the Jewish establishment has abused and threatened retaliation against intellectuals, journalists, and politicians who voice criticism of Israelis' policies or who support any kind of challenge, penalty, or restriction of aid to the Israeli state. Although the Jewish lobby is not a large one, the resources and connections, the commitment of its supporters, and its ties to the military-industrial complex make it a potent and political candidates vie with one another in vows of fealty to Israel. For the Jewish establishment itself, there appears to be no limits to Israeli violence against unarmed and unarmed civilians that will not be rationalized by alleged provocations. And if beatings and the cracking of the bones of women and children are acceptable, what next for the two-legged animals and grasshoppers? With the effective crowing of many of the politicians, intellectuals, journalists, and editors who are not already true believers, the stage is set for the institutionalization of myths, big lies, and doublespeak. Many of the myths center in the origins of the Israeli state and the basis for the exodus of Palestinians that followed, which are beyond the scope of this discussion. The concept of terrorism, which has been central to the Israeli efforts to dehumanize the Palestinians and provide the basis for a refusal to negotiate a political settlement, has been discussed in the previous section. Rejectionism and super-rejectionism. In parallel with the usage on terrorism, Western doublespeak is the Israeli state and the United States never reject, only the enemy does. The treatment is humorous, given the facts of the case. The New York Times, asked whether the PLO can step into the diplomatic breach as an acceptable negotiating partner with Israel, and answers, yes, if it renounces terror and its sterile rejectionism. Otherwise, Israel would not find the courage to go to the negotiating table with an organization formally dedicated to its destruction. If we ask why the stronger party should lack courage, but the weaker one, whose existence is not even recognized by the stronger, should be obliged to muster up the courage, the Times official offers no answer. Note the Times mention of the Palestinians' formal dedication to Israel's destruction, which permits it to avoid addressing the fact in January 1976 and periodically thereafter. The PLO accepted a practical proposal for a two-state settlement that amounted to de facto recognition and guarantees of Israeli security and sovereignty. In an editorial a month later, the Times has berated Mr. Arafat for persevering in his rejectionism, noting, however, that heading to a November 1st election, Israeli politicians seem lost in a wilderness of slogans. Editorial September 9th, 1988. On the one side, straightforward rejectionism. On the other, simple confusion. In the same editorial, the Times acknowledged that Shamir has said that he will never even talk to the PLO, and that Perez engages in his own evasive double talk. As noted earlier, Israeli analysts even explained the 1982 Lebanon invasion in terms of the Israeli leadership fear that Arafat's control over terrorism would force unwanted negotiations. The Israeli leadership has also shown exceptional hostilities to Israelis and Palestinians who hint at the possibility and desirability of mutual recognition. But for some unexplained reason, Israeli super-rejectionism never designated sterile rejectionism, and the burden of successfully reopening a diplomatic track is always on the PLO. The insufficiency, the hesitant feelers of the weaker party in the face of super-rejectionism is the entire focus of attention as rejectionism. This is beyond hypocrisy. So you can see that the Israeli government, what I gather from this is the Israeli government, doesn't want peace. They want they want Palestinians carrying out terrorism. So they promote it. They give the Palestinians, the appropriate violence that a state terrorist government would do, so that the Palestinians respond with, terrorism and with, violence. So, violence is a two-way street. Let's face it. We know the U.S. government, the Israeli government, and in this case, we're talking about the Israeli government. So let's just talk about that. The Israeli government likes violence. They egg on violence by being violent to the groups that they want to be violent to. So they want, a response from Lebanese. They bomb Lebanon, and then the Lebanese respond. They want a response in the Middle East. They, bombed Iran. They wanted a response from Lebanon. So then now they can bomb and, do open season on the Lebanese. This is a vicious campaign, but it's just like the American government. It's very similar to the American government. The American government eggs on a response. We remember George Bush with Saddam Hussein, the Bush Jr. He egged on Saddam to attack Kuwait, and then Saddam attacked Kuwait, and he called him a dirty Muslim terrorist, and he attacked. Just like that, Eisenhower egged on the Chinese to, attack, in Korea. He egged on the Chinese to attack Korea because they went to war in Korea and they were slaughtering North Koreans, reducing them to rubble. So China was forced to defend its sovereignty. And then they called them dirty gooks and said that they were the aggressors in the war. That's the Western hegemony, the United States and Israel and all the colonial regimes that back this nonsense. And they peddle lies. They are liars. They are deceivers of fact. They are racist gangsters. Agents of the Ku Klux Klan, terrorist American government. And that's what they deserve to be known as. The peace process, the Camp David Accords introduced, this is the last section actually, it's very good. The Camp David Accords introduced, at least for the Western media, sometimes called a quote-unquote peace process. The endearing phrase tells us that in the Western view, the agreements were a good thing. In fact, the Camp David Agreement successfully pulled Egypt out of effective opposition to Israelis' policies, thereby giving Israel a open season, but without resolving in any way the underlying Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Furthermore, while the Accords called for negotiations among Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and representatives of the Palestinians on the status of the Israeli-held territories, the Israeli Knesset quickly voted that the transition period it would act to fulfill its rights to sovereignty over Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza district, thus negating the agreement to negotiate. The ensuing settlement program in the occupied territories, internal repression, and continuous warfare indicates that the peace process actually facilitated a more efficient war process. The clear failure of the Accords to advance peace has not interfered in any way with the Western usage. A good thing deserves a warm phrase. Peace process. Anti-Semitism. With Israel's increased power and aggressiveness, its enlarged role as a Western enforcer against the lesser breach of the Middle East, and its utility as a colonial surrogate arms supplier of South Africa, Somoza, and the Nicaraguan Contras, Guatemala's, Honduras, and pre-Alfonsin Argentina. The attitude of traditional anti-Semites towards Israel has changed. In 1967, Xavier Vallet, who was responsible for thousands of Jewish deportations to the death camps as the Minister of Jewish Affairs under the Vichy France regime, wrote in an article in the right-wing French newspaper Aspects de la France, explaining that he was now a Zionist and expressing his support for Israel as its struggle against the Arabs. The fascist was effusive over the Jewish people's discovery of its nationality and their ethnic religious tendency to domination, a tendence dominatrix. Many other leaders of the radical right have flocked to the support of Israel. Arguably, this is because the dominant Israeli Semites are westernized and are in keeping their place more backward and troublesome Semites. The Israelis merit approval in the same way that Duarte, Sadat, Generals Thieu and Kai, Savimbi and their cadres, armies, and police do for their service to Western interests. A shift in attitude towards Semites has accompanied these new relationships, and Western contempt and hatred has been largely displaced from the former victims to the more threatening Semites, the latest set of victims. The change is hardly recognized in the West. Anti-Semitism is a word that applies only to attitudes towards the former victims, now integrated into Western power structures. So you can see anti-Semitism refers to attacks on Jews that are former victims of the Nazi regime. So anti-Semitism being brought up in the United States and by the Israeli government propaganda is just peddled doublespeak. I mean, they're, imprisoning, they're, suppressing dissent of people, but based on doublespeak. These are not anti-Semitic. Just to educate Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Trump or anybody else who's listening, these are not anti-Semitic. These are, normal, people who are, talking about racist Jews that are, joining the Western colonial hegemony in in their human rights abusing tendencies. So these are not anti-Semites. These are normal people. You can use anti-Semitic anything. You can extend anything into anything in a delusional and criminal butcherhood that the U.S. government and the Israeli government do anyway. They're delusional criminal butchers of the terrorist governments of the United States and Israel. The change is hardly recognized in the West. Anti-Semitism is a word that applies only to attitudes toward the former victims, now integrated into Western power structures. The hostility in the West to Arab Semites is never described as anti-Semitism. And many of the right-wing friends of Israel haven't sloughed off their traditional anti-Semitism and dislike of Jews. Thus, Jerry Falwell mounts traditional anti-Semitic sentiments easily and frequently, but loves and supports Israel and is honored and feted there. Is he an anti-Semite? In the transvaluation of the Jewish establishment in the United States, certainly for its large right-wing contingent, the usage of the word anti-Semitism has suddenly shifted from hostility, hate, and stereotyped attitude towards Jews to criticism of and hostility towards Israel for its criminal activity. Nixon's classic anti-Semitic utterances revealed on his tapes Reagan's incredible performance at the Nazi cemetery of Bitburg, Argentine state anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of the Christian and the radical right, and even the revelation of the U.S. official protection and patronage of Nazi murderers after World War II. All are treated benignly by the media, because these traditional manifestations of anti-Semitism are combined with support for Israel. Meanwhile, Jesse Jackson's reference to Jewish areas as Jaime towns is serious business because Jackson is not a supporter of Israel. In the world of establishment doublespeak, anti-Semitism has become first and foremost criticism of and hostility to Israel. Traditional anti-Semitism is of lesser importance, used strategically to denigrate those who display the really important failing. So you can see, the U.S. government. So we went over, a very good chapter. I am impressed with this book. There's only a few chapters left. There's only a total of, there's a big section on, the dictionary, which I won't go through, but, the total chapter is chapter 6. So we're on chapter 4. We'll get to chapter 6 by the end of the week. Basically, in summary, the U.S. government, it's committed, criminal activity. Its media is peddling doublespeak. It is a group of doublespeakers. It backed Duarte. It backed South African, apartheid. It backed, all of the different regimes in, South America. It backed the Argentine Videla. It backed, all of the different Israeli prime ministers in their campaigns of terror. And, it backed, Diem. It backed Diem. It backed Key. It backed Thu in Vietnam. And, it is, basically a group of, racist Ku Klux Klan terrorists of the United States. They peddle doublespeak. They commit human rights abuse. They, cause mass murder and genocide. And then when you call them out at it, they just look at you and say, you're a dirty dodhead anyway. I mean, we kill Hindus because we hate dodheads. They're dirty dodheads. That's what the U.S. government loves to say. That's what Donald Trump loves to say. And, we don't want to go through it again. We went through it with, Vietnam. We slaughtered them, and then we said they're dirty gooks. And Donald Trump, loves to say they're dirty spics at the border with Mexico. Those dirty spics are racists and, criminals, and they're drug traffickers. That's all they amount to. And we don't want them in America. So that's what you have, a doublespeak by the U.S. government, a dangerous group of people. And Donald Trump, we have 2 articles we said. We're not going to review them now. We'll review them at a later time. Donald Trump and his doublespeak. Trump 2.0, 100 days of Orwellian Newspeak. Basically, the facts on, peace, ignorance, strength, doublethink and reality control, using citizens as, hate, bearers of hate and hate speech, and, birthright citizenship, attacking Joe Biden, Day of Love, basically, the peaceful patriots in the Trump rally at the Capitol didn't do any assaulting at the Capitol building during the insurrection or the coup in the United States. Diversity, equality, and inclusion, right? I mean, this was basically, a simple thing. They, have, gender, all of the hate speech, destruction, and blaming it for the death of 67 people in an airline collision because of, diversity. They, blame diversity. This is doublespeak. Disinformation, misinformation, big characteristic of the Trump administration. Anything Trump declares is false. Anything declared to be disinformation and misinformation by liberal fact-checking groups of elite experts can be regarded to be true and trustworthy. There's an efficiency department. This is another, double speak. It's, meant to remove, minorities and immigrants from, American, government jobs. That's what the Department of Government Efficiency is. Invasion by immigrants. It's a national emergency. These kinds of things are Trumpian doublespeak. Harmful foreign trade packages, national energy emergency, drilling and less oversight. These are all doublespeak concepts. The crushing cost of everyday living requires deregulation of the American industries. They're fake jobs. The U.S. government denies that its government workers work. They're not really jobs. Another, double speak, calling, workers lazy and parasites, because they're immigrants. GDP calculated, Trump's Commerce Secretary, new measure of productivity, changing the themes. Gulf of America, sudden change. Body of water from the Gulf of Mexico, another, form of double speak, trying to show everyone that we're boss. We've got, a bunch of different names. So these are all included in an article on doublespeak, which I will include. I'm not actually going to review this article. This is more of like, a potpourri of words, like different words. You can just run through the words and see all the doublespeak that the Trump administration is peddling to you. And then there's another article. There's two more articles. One is Trump is moving America to a land of doublespeak, but we mustn't be fooled by it. And the other one is U.S. prosecutors investigate Colombia's president and a one-time Trump foe. And there's a third one on, doublespeak. There's a third one on doublespeak that I will put in the chat box when I do that presentation on Trump. Just a couple headlines on the Iran war, updates on the Iran war. Trump is saying that he's postponing strikes on Iran power plants. We're seeing Trump is, there's a deadline. There's attack on energy sites. He's going to start attacking the energy sites. 5 days, he's going to start attacking the energy sites. If Iran does not open the Strait of Hormuz, the Iran war is, worsening the U.S. government's, place in the world polity. They are, prestige vacuum. They're racists peddling lies, lies of the American government. The Ku Klux Klan terrorist administration of Donald Trump. He's peddling all sorts of lies, and, that's what they're saying. And, basically that's it. Those are the war. There's not really much in the form of war headlines. I'm just going to check one more, paper and see if there's anything there. So day 23, basically, it was airstrikes and missiles launched continue to inflict heavy casualties and extensive destruction in Iran. The U.S. president threatened to hit Iranian power plants unless Iran fully opens the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. Iran fired back, warning that any attack on its energy facilities would make power plants in countries hosting U.S. bases legitimate targets. U.S. President Donald Trump threatened on Saturday to hit and obliterate Iranian power plants if the country fails to fully open the Strait of Hormuz in 48 hours. If Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate the various power plants, starting to the biggest one first, he wrote in a Truth Social. So again, General Trump, big commander-in-chief, the dabbler in the arts of military war, is issuing ultimatums to the Iranian government after he provoked a war of aggression against the Iranian government, and like a hypocritic doublespeaker and an actor of Orwell's novel 1984. He's now threatening the Iranian government with consequences for his crime of aggression. Typical American doublespeak, double pedal. You issue the ultimatum when you commit the criminal act. He is a criminally deluded man of the U.S. government. He is a criminally deluded white racist of the American government, and that is what he should be remembered for in this war of aggression. Israel Defense Minister Katz and Benjamin Netanyahu had ordered the military to immediately destroy all bridges over Lebanon's Litani River used by Hezbollah. Rocket fire in Lebanon by Hezbollah struck two vehicles in the Upper Galilee, killing one man, Israeli authorities say. The Israeli military chief has approved plans to expand the offensive in Lebanon and say that the military is prepared for a prolonged operation. Chief of the General Staff, Ayel Zamir, approved the advancement of targeted ground operations on Saturday following a meeting with Northern Command leadership, the military announced in a statement on Sunday. The Israeli military said Sunday that the fight against Iran and Hezbollah was expected to last weeks, adding that Israel had dropped more than 10,000 munitions on thousands of targets across Iran since February 28. So you can see this second front is, another secretive front in this war of aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are, slaughtering Hezbollah. They're slaughtering, civilians in Lebanon. The Israeli government is, conducting its vicious slaughter campaign. And you can see we know someone. We know someone. If, you want to be a Jew with impunity, you can read his book. He says you're a racist terrorist. That's what he says to the Israeli government. So, we know what the facts are. We know who's telling the truth. We know who's not telling the truth and who's peddling the, double speak and lies. Iranian Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi and European Union policy chief spoke by phone to discuss the political security and humanitarian fallout by the strikes on Iran. Iran's army said that its air defenses had targeted the F-15E Strike Eagle fighter jets in this country's southern province. The army said the aircraft was tracked and engaged by surface-to-air missiles as it flew over southern coastal areas near Hormuz Island earlier in the day. Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf warned that the energy and oil infrastructure across the region could face irreversible destruction if the United States targets Iran's power plants. Iran's primary military command, Qatam al-Aniyaba Central Headquarters, issued a statement warning that power plants in countries hosting U.S. bases would be considered legitimate targets if the United States attacks Iran's power facilities. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian said the Strait of Hormuz is open to all except those who violate Iran's territory. Iran's foreign ministry also confirmed that the strait remains open to navigation with necessary measures in place due to wartime conditions, dismissing concerns that the vital waterway has been blocked. Araghchi called the United Nations its nuclear watchdog and the Security Council to take immediate decisive action regarding U.S. and Israeli attacks against Iran's peaceful and safeguarded atomic sites and facilities. He made the plea in a letter addressed to General Antonio Guterres and members of the Security Council, according to a statement released by the Iran Foreign Ministry. So, the United States government, let's just bring up a point here, right? So what's the purpose of attacking the power plant facilities, Mr. Trump? Is it to, destroy the power grid in Iran and make the people face, conditions of, blackouts, no electricity, right? I thought you were criticizing your government, your human rights champions of the United States government, the vicious, racist, anti-Islamic, anti-Buddhist, anti-Hindu, and anti-Black and Hispanic, mass murdering rogues, criticized, the Russian government for attacking power grids in Ukraine, but now we're going to attack Iranian power grids. These are, again, human rights abuse. ICC put a warrant of arrest on Vladimir Putin for attacking power grids. The United States government attacked power grids. It should have an ICC arrest warrant against Donald Trump. That is the equal statement, for equality. That is the equal statement. The U.S. government is committing war crimes here, and this attack on power grids to destroy the power structure in the Iranian government and the Iranian people is meant to keep the Iranian people in the dark during a campaign of terror that they may be, following up with a ground invasion. So let's stay tuned and be aware that the U.S. government is not, done with its dirty deeds here in, the Islamic Republic of Iran. The racist, Ku Klux Klan Christian terrorists of the American government are not done with their dirty deeds here. The Iraqi resistance in Iraq, an umbrella for Iraq's pro-militias, said it carried out 21 operations against occupation bases in Iraq over the past 24 hours. The CAA, the Civilian Aviation Authority, announced another 72-hour extension for the country's airspace closure to all arriving, departing, and overlying aircraft, citing ongoing security concerns. Lebanon, a senior Iranian official, said Tehran is carrying out a pre-planned multi-phase strategy in response to U.S.-Israeli attacks, while setting 6 conditions for ending the conflict. Lebanon-based Al Mayadeen reported more than 3,800 people have been killed or injured in the ongoing Israeli strikes on Lebanon since March 2nd, the health ministry said, reporting 1,029 deaths and 2,786 injuries. Israeli warplanes struck the strategic Kazmia Bridge over the Litani River in southern Lebanon Sunday. Lebanon's national news agency reported Israel launched a new wave of airstrikes across the region. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun condemned Israel's targeting and destruction of infrastructure and vital facilities in southern Lebanon, particularly the Kazmia Bridge over the Litani River and other bridges. So you can see quick headlines on the on the war on Iran, the U.S. government and its war on Iran, and the Israeli government's war on Lebanon. Enjoy doublespeak. I highly advise this book. Trump 2.0 is a dangerous thing. He is an anti-immigrant, white supremacist, fascist, and you have to be concerned about this man. He is a dangerous man. He is a war criminal. He is a slaughterer of immigrants. He is a slaughterer of colored people from all parts of the world. And be very concerned and invest in books. The best way is invest in printed textbooks. Don't buy Kindle books. I advise you not to buy Kindle books because Kindle books are propaganda. Okay. Any book put in print is in Kindle is propaganda. The books to buy are print books that are available by authors. Search Noam Chomsky, search Edward Herman. Ignorance is not bliss in Trump 2.0 and Orwellian doublespeak. Again, Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.